The laughter echoed through the hall, sharp and mocking. As she stood there, her hands trembling, she could barely hear the words being thrown her way. "You've ruined your life," someone whispered, while others snickered behind their hands. They didn't get it, couldn't understand why she'd chosen him, a man with nothing but dreams and a heart full of love. The whispers grew louder as they watched her walk away from her wedding, the day she had imagined for so long, turned into a spectacle of judgment. But she didn't care. Not then. Jasmine had never cared much for the opinions of others. Raised in a world where social status and appearances were everything, she had learned early on that her life was going to be different. She wasn't the kind of woman to follow the path others laid out for her. The idea of an arranged marriage to a wealthy businessman or a politician had never been appealing. But marrying a poor man, especially one of a different race? That was a step too far for the people she had grown up with. The crowd in the room, dressed in their finest clothes, all stared at her as if she had betrayed some unspoken rule of society. There was her father, his face tight with disapproval, barely able to hide the anger in his eyes. Her mother's eyes were red, and she refused to meet her gaze, clutching her pearls in a gesture that screamed embarrassment. Friends who had known her for years stood by, shocked, shaking their heads. Jasmine looked at the man who had stood beside her for years, the man who had never cared about her background, her family, or their expectations. Leon was everything she had ever wanted. He had the kind of spirit she could never find in the rich, privileged men her family had tried to pair her with. Yes, he was poor, but in a world obsessed with wealth and power, he had something far more valuable: integrity. Leon was the kind of man who knew what it was like to struggle, to fight for every scrap of happiness he could find. His family didn't own houses or businesses, they lived in a cramped apartment where every dollar counted. Yet, he had ambition. And more than that, he had the kind of love that was unshakable. For Jasmine, it wasn't about what he had, but about what he was willing to give. She had known from the moment they had met that he was different. It wasn't just his kindness or his humor that drew her to him, but the way he made her feel seen, like she mattered. Every day, he encouraged her to chase her dreams, to live life on her terms. It was a love that didn't ask her to conform to anyone's expectations but her own. But her family didn't see that. They only saw a man without wealth, without status. They saw someone beneath her, someone they could never accept. "You'll regret this," her father had warned just hours before the ceremony, his voice trembling with the weight of years of expectations. "Marry someone of your class, Jasmine. Marry someone who can give you a future. This man? He'll bring you nothing but hardship." But Jasmine had already made up her mind. She walked down the aisle, ignoring the murmurs, the disapproving stares. The wedding vows exchanged were simple, but filled with sincerity. Leon didn't have a grand ring to place on her finger, no palace to carry her across the threshold. But he had something better, a promise. A promise that no matter where life took them, they would face it together, with love and hope as their guide. Now, as she stood there, on what should have been the happiest day of her life, it felt like a nightmare. Her father's words haunted her. She hadn't realized how deeply they had cut her until now, in the face of their rejection. It was as though everything she had fought for, everything she had believed in, had just crumbled around her. Jasmine took a deep breath and held Leon's hand tighter, as if his touch could steady her against the weight of the world. She couldn't let herself falter now. Not when she had come so far. But the sting of the disapproval in the room was almost unbearable. A part of her wanted to run, to escape from the judgment and the cold, indifferent eyes staring at her. She wanted to scream, to shout that she loved him, that she had chosen him because he was worth it. But instead, she smiled, forcing the words to come out. "We'll be okay," she whispered, barely audible above the whispers of the crowd. Leon squeezed her hand and nodded, though his face reflected the same pain. He had been through so much, and now, the woman he loved was being torn apart in front of him. But they were in this together. The reception that followed was a blur of forced smiles and fake pleasantries. People made polite conversation with them, their eyes darting away when they thought no one was looking. Jasmine could feel the weight of every gaze, the heavy judgment of those who had once been her friends and family. By the end of the evening, the couple found themselves alone in a small hotel room, a far cry from the luxurious halls their families had once envisioned for them. Jasmine sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers trembling as she removed her wedding ring and stared at it in her palm. Leon stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. "You were right," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the words. "This is not the life they wanted for you." Jasmine's heart broke at the sadness in his tone. "I don't care about what they wanted. I care about what we want. We've always known it was going to be hard," he said, his voice rough. "But I never wanted you to feel judged," she finished for him. "I know. But I've already made my choice. We'll make it work. Together." She got up and walked over to him, her fingers brushing his arm gently. "We'll build our life, Leon. We'll make our own way. We don't need anyone else's approval." Leon turned to face her, his eyes softening. I just don't want you to regret it." "I won't regret it. Not for 1 second," she said, with more certainty than she felt. "You're the only one I've ever wanted." It was a silent promise they shared, a vow to fight against the world's expectations and create a future for themselves. But little did they know, the real challenges were yet to come. Years passed. What had started as a small, quiet life soon grew into something neither of them could have predicted. Jasmine and Leon's humble beginnings, filled with hard work and struggle, soon became the foundation for something greater. They had always been a team, pushing through adversity, supporting each other through the ups and downs. But as the years unfolded, their lives began to change in ways no one, especially those who had mocked them, could have foreseen. They started their own business, a small cafe in a rundown neighborhood that many people would have overlooked. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And it thrived, slowly at first, then steadily. Leon's passion for food, paired with Jasmine's drive and business sense, made it a success. But success didn't come without its costs. They faced countless challenges. Late nights, sleepless days, arguments about money and direction, and even doubts about whether they had made the right choice. Through it all, they stuck together. And slowly, they began to make a name for themselves. It wasn't long before their story began to spread, how a woman from a wealthy family had chosen a poor man to marry, defying her family's expectations. People took notice. People began to ask questions. How had they built this business? How had they come so far? But it wasn't just their business that began to turn heads. Jasmine, too, had changed in ways that no one had expected. The young woman who had once been seen as weak, naive, and a product of her family's privilege had become someone else entirely. She was confident, ambitious, and unafraid to take risks. She was respected now, not just for her success, but for the strength she had shown in the face of adversity. And that, perhaps, was the most surprising twist of all. The woman who had been laughed at for marrying Leon, the woman who had been dismissed as someone who would never make it, was now the one everyone wanted to be like. They mocked her marriage to a poor man, but now, years later, they were envious of her life. The journey had been long, and the road had been filled with more obstacles than they could count. But as they stood side by side, looking at the business they had built and the life they had created, they knew they had made the right choice. Jasmine had never regretted it. And she knew that the people who had mocked her, who had tried to tear her down, would never understand what it meant to fight for something, to love someone so fiercely that nothing could stand in your way. But what they would soon find out, what they could never have predicted, was just how far that love could take them. Jasmine glanced at her phone, the text message that had just come in flashing across the screen, "We need to talk." It's about Leon. Her stomach dropped. What could this be about? Jasmine stared at the message on her phone, her fingers frozen on the screen. It wasn't like Leon to keep secrets, especially from her. They had built their lives on trust, on the understanding that nothing was too big, too small, or too dangerous to talk about. So why, then, did this message feel like a warning, a sudden storm on the horizon she hadn't seen coming? She sat on the edge of the bed, the room growing colder as the seconds passed. Leon was in the kitchen, his back turned to her as he hummed softly, probably lost in thought, preparing their dinner after a long day at the cafe. Everything had seemed fine. Their business was thriving, they were making progress, and for the first time in years, it felt like they were on the edge of something big, something great. But now, with the phone in her hand, a chill ran down her spine. We need to talk. It's about Leon. The words echoed in her mind. She didn't recognize the number, which only made her more anxious. Who would send a cryptic message about Leon? And what could it mean? She had never felt this sense of dread creeping in. It was as though someone had thrown a stone into the still waters of her life, and now ripples were forming, shaking the surface. Jasmine quickly stood up, her legs shaky, her heart beating faster. She couldn't let it go. She needed answers. She pressed the phone to her ear and dialed the number back, hoping it was some mistake, hoping it would just be a wrong number or a miscommunication. But when the phone rang, each second felt like an eternity. The phone picked up on the third ring. "Hello?" a voice said, a man's voice, unfamiliar and sharp. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What do you mean? It's about Leon." The man didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Jasmine felt the weight of the silence between them. "You need to come to the old warehouse on 12th Street, the man finally said, his voice low and unyielding. "It's about your husband. You need to hear this. Alone." The line went dead before Jasmine could speak. She was left holding the phone, her mind racing, a million thoughts spinning in every direction. Why 12th Street? What could this man possibly want with her or Leon? The question hung in the air, unanswered. She didn't know who the man was, but something told her it wasn't a coincidence. That feeling, the one she couldn't shake, told her this was something serious. Something big. Her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't ignore this, not now, not when Leon's name was at the center of it. She had to go. She had to understand what was happening. But should she tell him? No. If the message was truly about him, telling him now might jeopardize whatever information she could gather. It was better to go alone. The last thing she wanted was to put him in danger, not when they had worked so hard to create a life together. Jasmine grabbed her jacket, her mind racing as she tried to think of any possible explanation for what was happening. But nothing made sense. She glanced at Leon in the kitchen, his back to her. The peaceful evening they had planned for themselves seemed so distant now, like it belonged to someone else, in another time. "I'll be back soon," she whispered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. The old warehouse on 12th Street was nothing more than a forgotten relic of the city's past, a place where rust and decay had claimed the buildings, leaving behind an eerie silence. Jasmine's car crunched over the gravel as she approached the massive structure, its windows boarded up and its doors locked with chains. She could see the faint outline of a figure standing near the entrance, shrouded in the shadows, waiting. The tension in her body was unbearable. Every instinct told her to turn around, to drive back home and confront Leon with whatever had just happened. But her legs moved on their own, carrying her closer to the figure. As she stepped out of the car, the wind bit at her skin, sending a chill through her bones. The figure stepped forward into the dim light, revealing a man in a dark coat, his face partially hidden under a hood. "You came," the man said, his voice low and raspy. He didn't offer a hand to shake, didn't seem surprised by her presence. In fact, he almost looked relieved. "Who are you?" Jasmine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She was far from calm, but she wasn't going to show him how frightened she felt. "My name's Carter," the man said. "I'm an old friend of your husband's." Jasmine's eyes widened. Leon had never mentioned anyone by that name. She studied the man, trying to gauge whether she could trust him. Something in his posture, the way he carried himself, told her he wasn't lying. But that only deepened the mystery. "An old friend?" Jasmine repeated, confusion taking over. "I don't understand. Leon doesn't talk about old friends. He never mentioned you." Carter's face darkened, and he stepped closer. "He wouldn't. Not after what happened." Jasmine's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What happened?" Without saying another word, Carter motioned for her to follow him. "Come inside. I'll explain." Reluctantly, Jasmine followed him into the warehouse. Inside, the cold, stale air hit her like a wall. The warehouse was a cavernous space, filled with old crates and forgotten machinery. The floor was covered in dust, and the only light came from a dim bulb hanging overhead, casting long shadows across the room. Carter stopped near an old table, motioning for her to take a seat. She hesitated but eventually complied. Her eyes never leaving his face as he settled into the chair across from her. "Leon doesn't know you're here, does he?" Carter asked, his tone flat. "No," Jasmine replied, her voice low. "I came because I need answers. You said you knew my husband. What's going on? Why did you send that message?" Carter exhaled slowly, as though weighing his words carefully. "It's a long story, but it's one Leon needs to hear too. I wasn't the only one who tried to keep him out of this mess. But he made a choice." "What choice?" Jasmine pressed, her patience wearing thin. "What's happening?" Carter leaned forward, his gaze intense. "The people Leon used to work with, the people he left behind, they're not happy. They want him back, Jasmine. And they'll do anything to get him." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Leon doesn't work for anyone anymore. We've built our own life." "Not entirely," Carter said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You see, Leon's past is far darker than he's ever told you. Before he met you, he was involved in something dangerous. Something that people like me are still trying to clean up." Jasmine shook her head in disbelief. "You're lying. Leon would have told me. He would never keep something like that from me." Carter's eyes softened, but there was no sympathy in them. "You think he would have told you? After everything he's worked for? Leon was running from his past when he met you. He thought he could leave it behind. But some things don't stay buried forever." Jasmine's mind raced. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. Leon had always been honest with her, hadn't he? He had never hidden anything from her, at least, that's what she had believed. But now, this man, Carter, was telling her a story that shattered everything she thought she knew. Leon's past was catching up with him. And it wasn't just his past, it was hers too. Carter stood up, his face grim. "You need to leave, Jasmine. Go back to Leon. Tell him to stay away from me, stay away from what's coming. It's not over. And if you don't, everything he's worked for, everything you've both worked for, will be destroyed." Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. "What are you talking about?" she asked, barely able to breathe. But Carter was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows. "You'll find out soon enough." Jasmine's hands gripped the steering wheel as she sped through the darkened streets. The lights of the city blurred around her, but it felt as though she were moving in slow motion. Her mind was a storm of confusion, disbelief, and raw fear. She couldn't even remember the drive back from the warehouse. Her thoughts had taken over, drowning out everything around her. Leon's words echoed in her mind. "You're just overreacting. There's nothing to worry about." He had said that only a week ago when she tried to ask about the strange message, the unsettling feeling she'd had that something was wrong. He had always reassured her with calm words, but now, after everything she'd heard from Carter, those words felt like lies, like a shield meant to keep her in the dark. By the time she arrived home, the weight on her chest had grown heavier. The house felt different now, darker, colder. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floorboards underfoot only seemed to heighten her sense of unease. Jasmine tossed her keys onto the counter and tried to catch her breath, but the air felt thick, suffocating. She had barely stepped into the living room when she heard Leon's voice from the hallway. "Jasmine? You okay?" The sound of his voice was like a distant memory now, a voice she almost didn't recognize. He wasn't the man she thought he was, and she didn't know how to bridge that gap anymore. Jasmine froze, her heart racing. She turned toward him, but the words she wanted to say stuck in her throat. How could she confront him? How could she ask him about the past he had clearly been hiding, a past that had now caught up with them both? She forced herself to take a step forward, but before she could speak, Leon appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a towel. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "Hey, babe. You're home early. Everything okay?" Jasmine's pulse quickened. She tried to steady herself, tried to find her voice. "Leon, we need to talk." His expression shifted, the easy smile fading. He put the towel down and took a step closer. "What's going on? You're acting strange." She didn't know how to start. She didn't know where to begin. "Leon," she repeated, her voice trembling. "Who is Carter?" Leon's face went pale, and the air between them thickened with an invisible tension. For a moment, Jasmine wondered if he had heard her right. Maybe there was some mistake. Maybe he didn't know who Carter was. But she knew deep down that wasn't true. She could see the fear in his eyes. "Where did you hear that name?" Leon's voice was tight, controlled. "I went to see him tonight," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said you were involved in something. Something dangerous. He said you've been hiding things from me, and that your past is coming back." Leon's eyes shifted, the warmth draining from his face as he took a step back, his hands trembling. Jasmine felt her heart drop into her stomach. She had never seen him like this. He was a man who could face anything, he always had been. But now, standing before her, he seemed so small, so distant. "Jasmine," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I never wanted you to find out. I didn't want to drag you into this." "Into what?" she demanded. "Into what, Leon? What have you been hiding?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and fear clear in his eyes. "I didn't want this for you. I wanted us to have a life, our life. But that's not how things work, Jasmine. It never was. I've tried to keep it from you. Tried to keep you safe, but there are people. Dangerous people who won't let go of the past." Her chest tightened. "What people? Who are they? What have you gotten us into?" Leon looked away, his gaze distant as though he were seeing something far beyond her, something that terrified him. "They're from my old life. I was part of something I should never have been involved in. It wasn't just some job, Jasmine. It was a group, a syndicate. I thought I could leave it all behind when I met you, thought I could build something better. But the past always finds a way of catching up." "Leon, no," Jasmine whispered. "Not you. You're not that man. You told me you wanted to start over." He finally met her gaze, his face filled with pain. "I did. I wanted to be better for you. But there's no escaping it. And now they know about us. They know about you, Jasmine. And they'll do whatever it takes to get me back into the fold. Jasmine shook her head in disbelief. You're telling me that these people will hurt me, hurt us, because of something you did years ago? Yes, Leon said, his voice hoarse. They'll do worse than hurt us if we don't do what they want. Carter is part of the group that's been trying to clean things up. He's been trying to stop them, but they're too powerful. And now they've come for me. I can't protect you anymore, Jasmine. I can't protect us. Her mind was reeling. She had always known Leon had a past, but this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Her world was unraveling, piece by piece. You should have told me, she said, her voice shaking. You should have told me from the beginning. Leon's face crumpled, and he reached for her. I'm sorry. I thought I could protect you from it. But I was wrong. I don't know what to do now. Jasmine felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. How long has this been going on, Leon? How long have you been hiding this from me? Leon's eyes darkened, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Too long. But I thought we had time. I thought we could outrun it. The weight of his words pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. She didn't know what to think anymore. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with everything, wasn't the man she thought he was. A loud knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and both of them froze. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat as she looked toward the door. Leon's face turned ashen, and for the first time, Jasmine saw genuine fear in his eyes. I'll get it, she said, trying to steady her breath. She had to be strong now. For herself. For him. They had to face this together, no matter how ugly it was. She walked toward the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. But before she could open it, the door swung open on its own, revealing Carter standing in the doorway, his expression grim. Jasmine, Carter said softly, his gaze flicking to Leon. We don't have time. They're already here. The chill that ran through Jasmine's veins was like nothing she had ever felt before. The world she had known, the life she had built with Leon, was slipping through her fingers. Who's here? Jasmine demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper. They're already outside, Carter said. They've come for him. And if we don't act fast, they'll come for you too. Jasmine's heart pounded as the room seemed to close in around her. She had no choice now, no choice but to step into a world she didn't understand, a world where survival was no longer a promise but a fight. Her gaze locked with Leon's, and she saw the same fear in his eyes that she felt. This was it. The past was no longer something they could escape. It was coming for them. And there was nowhere to run. The air outside was cold, biting, but Jasmine could barely feel it. The chill creeping into her bones was coming from something far darker than the night. Carter's words, still echoing in her mind, seemed to hang in the air between them like a ghost that wouldn't leave. They're already outside. They've come for him. She stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. The weight of what had just been revealed, Leon's past, his involvement with dangerous people, the syndicate that was now hunting them, had hit her like a freight train. Nothing made sense anymore. How had it all come to this? How had she gone from a life of quiet suburban peace to one that was teetering on the edge of chaos? Carter's face was tight with urgency. His eyes flicked nervously toward the street, scanning the shadows as though expecting someone to leap from them at any moment. Leon, standing a few feet behind her, looked like he wanted to run, but he knew he couldn't. Not anymore. The ghosts from his past had caught up with him, and now they were coming for both of them. Jasmine, Carter said, his voice low but firm. I know you don't want to hear this, but we need to move, and we need to move fast. She turned to him, her heart thumping wildly in her chest. Move? What do you mean, move? What's happening? What are they going to do to us? Leon stepped forward, his face pale but determined. We don't have time to explain everything right now. The most important thing is that we leave, now. Jasmine felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. She was no stranger to danger, having grown up in a tough neighborhood, but nothing in her life had prepared her for this. Her husband, the man she had built her life with, had lied to her, about everything. She couldn't even trust him anymore, not entirely. And Carter, while clearly trying to help, had been a part of this web of secrets too. She had no choice now but to trust them. But her trust was fragile, hanging by the thinnest of threads. Where are we going? She asked, her voice tight with fear. Carter took a deep breath and glanced at Leon, as though confirming something silently. Between them. I have a safe house, he said, his eyes steady but dark with a kind of knowledge that made Jasmine uneasy. It's a place where we can lay low for a while. Get our heads straight. But we need to move fast. They're not far behind. Leon's jaw clenched. Carter's right. We've got to go. If they're here already, it means they've been watching us. We can't stay here. Jasmine felt the room spinning as the weight of their situation settled over her. She glanced at Leon, her eyes searching for something, anything, that would tell her this wasn't as bad as it seemed. But there was nothing. His face was drawn with fear and regret, a man broken by the truth of his own actions. Do you trust him? She asked quietly, her eyes never leaving Leon's. He hesitated for a long moment, the silence between them hanging heavy. Finally, he nodded. Yes, he said, his voice low. Carter's trying to help us. He's been helping me for a while now. That didn't answer her question. But it was enough for now. Jasmine took a shaky breath, the weight of their reality pressing down on her like an avalanche. Okay, she said, her voice more steady than she felt. I'll go. But you have to promise me that once we're safe, you'll tell me everything. No more secrets, Leon. I can't do this anymore if you keep lying. Leon's eyes softened, but there was no apology in them. Only the stark truth of the situation. I promise, he whispered. Without another word, they left the house. Jasmine's heart was pounding, and her mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions. How had this happened? How had she gotten so caught up in a world she didn't understand? They hurried to Carter's car, which was parked at the end of the driveway. As they climbed into the vehicle, Jasmine felt a strange sense of finality. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, she was in this with Leon, for better or worse. As Carter sped down the road, the city lights flickering past them, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her body tensed as she glanced out the window, her nerves on edge. She didn't know who was chasing them, but she could feel the danger closing in. The car's headlights illuminated the empty streets, but every shadow seemed to hold something more sinister. Where are we going? Jasmine asked again, her voice laced with anxiety. She needed to know. She needed some kind of reassurance that they were doing the right thing. To the safe house, Carter said, his eyes focused on the road ahead. It's about an hour away from here. We'll be safe there. At least for a while. Jasmine nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. Safe? How could anything be safe now? After everything that had happened, after the revelation of Leon's past and the threats now following them, how could she trust that anything would be okay? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Each second felt heavier than the last. She kept her gaze locked on the road ahead, searching for any sign of danger. Every time a car passed them, every time a shadow moved in the periphery of her vision, she felt her heart leap into her throat. Leon remained silent beside her, his hands gripping the seat. He hadn't said anything since they'd left the house, and Jasmine could feel the tension radiating off him. The silence between them was deafening. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, but she didn't know if she could. She wasn't sure who this man beside her even was anymore. His secrets had built a wall between them, one that felt impossible to tear down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Carter turned onto a narrow, dimly lit road. The trees were thick on either side, their branches swaying in the wind like dark fingers reaching toward the car. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken as the car's headlights illuminated an old, weathered house at the end of the road. "This is it," Carter said, pulling into the driveway. The house loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. Jasmine's stomach twisted. She didn't know why, but something about the house felt wrong. It wasn't just the isolation or the way it seemed to stand out against the surrounding trees. It was the feeling of being watched, the gnawing sense that they weren't as alone as they should be. Carter parked the car and turned to face them. "We'll go inside, stay quiet, and figure out our next move. I'll get in touch with some people who can help. But we need to stay low. No one can know we're here." Leon nodded grimly, his face hardening. "I know. We'll be careful." Jasmine wasn't so sure. As they stepped out of the car and approached the house, her senses were on high alert. She couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in on them, and the walls of the safe house, for all their secrecy, would do little to protect them. But for now, it was the only place they had. And she would have to trust Carter. She had no choice. The door creaked open as Carter unlocked it, revealing a small, dimly lit entryway. The air inside was stale, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they stepped inside. "Welcome to the safe house," Carter said softly, glancing over his shoulder. "It's not much, but it'll do." Jasmine stepped inside, her heart still pounding in her chest. She didn't feel safe. Not yet. And she wasn't sure she ever would again. As she stepped further into the house, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The walls felt too close, the air too heavy. And as she glanced over at Leon, she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, perhaps, or something darker, that sent a chill down her spine. In that moment, she realized the truth: the danger wasn't just outside. It was in this house with them, and they were running out of time. The silence in the house was suffocating, the kind of silence that presses against you from all sides, until you can't breathe, until you wonder if it's real. Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of this old, dilapidated house were closing in on her. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made her jump. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her nerves fraying, unsure of who or what might be lurking in the shadows. Leon was pacing in the small living room, his steps heavy, each movement making the floor groan in protest. He was still on edge, but there was something in his eyes now, something darker, that made Jasmine uncomfortable. He wasn't the man she had married. He wasn't the man who had promised her a life of stability and peace. This version of Leon was distant, haunted, and she didn't know if she could trust him anymore. Carter had left them alone in the house, promising to make some calls to secure their safety. He had insisted that they lay low until he returned, but Jasmine wasn't so sure that staying in this place was the safest option. She had no idea who Carter was really working for, or if he was telling them the full truth. There were too many unanswered questions, too many secrets that still needed to be uncovered. Her mind drifted back to the moment they had arrived at the house. The way Carter had looked over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously, made her skin crawl. As soon as they stepped inside, he had locked the door with a quick, deliberate motion. But it wasn't the door that made her uneasy, it was the look in Carter's eyes, the way he seemed to be hiding something. Jasmine tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered, gnawing at her insides like a restless animal. "Jasmine," Leon said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. He stopped pacing and turned to face her. We need to talk. She looked up at him, his face drawn and pale. He looked exhausted, like a man who had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for far too long. She had always known that his past was complicated, but the secrets he had kept from her were beginning to unravel in ways that terrified her. About what? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leon took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers. He looked like he was about to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he turned away and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. Jasmine could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his muscles were coiled as if he were preparing for something. His gaze remained fixed on the street, as though he were expecting someone, or something, to appear. She stood up, moving closer to him. "Leon," she said, her voice softer now. "You can't keep doing this. You have to tell me what's going on. Who are these people? Why are they after us? And why didn't you tell me everything from the beginning?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes remained glued to the street, his expression unreadable. Jasmine waited, her heart pounding in her chest, each passing second dragging her deeper into the pit of uncertainty. She wanted to scream, to demand the answers she so desperately needed, but she knew that wouldn't help. They were already in too deep. Finally, Leon spoke, his voice low and strained. "You don't understand, Jasmine. You couldn't understand." Jasmine's frustration grew. "Try me. Please. I deserve to know." He ran a hand through his hair, his movements shaky. "I've spent years trying to outrun my past. But now it's caught up with me. And I don't know how to protect you from it. I don't know if I can." Her heart twisted at the desperation in his voice. It was the first time she had heard him sound so vulnerable, so broken. It was the first time he had admitted that he was scared. Jasmine felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly replaced by anger. She had been the one to stand by him, the one to trust him when no one else would. And yet, he had kept her in the dark, kept her in a life of lies. "I don't care about your past, Leon," she said, her voice firm. "I care about the future. I care about us. If you really want to protect me, you need to start telling me the truth." Leon's face crumpled, and he looked away, as though he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. "I didn't want you to get involved in this. I didn't want to drag you into this mess. But now, it's too late." Jasmine felt the weight of his words settle over her like a thick fog. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than they could imagine. She wanted to yell at him, to demand answers, but instead, she just stood there, feeling powerless. Minutes passed in strained silence. Jasmine couldn't stand it anymore. She had to know what was going on, even if it meant hearing things she wasn't ready for. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you do, Leon? What's so bad that they're after us?" For the first time, Leon turned to face her fully. His eyes were filled with a kind of sadness, a deep, soul-crushing regret. "I got involved with the wrong people. People who don't care about anyone but themselves. And when I tried to walk away, they made sure I couldn't." Jasmine felt her heart drop. She had always known that Leon had been involved in some shady things before they met, but hearing him say it aloud made it all too real. The truth was sinking in, and it was worse than anything she had imagined. "The syndicate," he continued, his voice cracking. "They're a criminal organization, involved in everything from drugs to human trafficking. I thought I could get out, but they wouldn't let me. They wanted me in, whether I liked it or not." Jasmine's mind was spinning, trying to process the information. She had heard whispers of such organizations, but she had never imagined that Leon would be a part of one. She had always thought he was just a man with a troubled past. Not a man caught up in something this dark. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Leon stepped toward her, his eyes pleading. Because I didn't want you to see me like this. I didn't want you to know who I really was. Jasmine shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. But I already knew you weren't perfect. I knew you had a past. I just wanted to be with you. To share a life with you. But now, I don't know who you are anymore. Leon reached out, touching her arm gently, his touch warm against the cold tension in the room. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. Jasmine pulled away, her mind racing. The weight of everything she had just learned was too much to bear. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had been hiding a dark, dangerous secret. And now that secret was threatening to destroy everything they had built together. As she stood there, torn between the love she still felt for Leon and the betrayal she couldn't ignore, she heard a sound. A faint noise, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make her freeze. She turned toward the door, her heart racing. It was a knock. Someone was at the door. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. The knock was too deliberate, too calculated. It wasn't the sound of someone lost, trying to find shelter. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly who they were looking for. The door was locked, but that wouldn't stop them. Jasmine's pulse pounded in her ears, her mind spinning with possibilities. Could it be the people Leon had been running from? Or was it someone else, someone even more dangerous? Whoever it was, one thing was certain, they had found them. Jasmine's heartbeat pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, staring at the door. The knock echoed again, louder this time, sharper. Whoever was on the other side wasn't waiting. They knew they had someone inside. They knew they were close to getting what they wanted. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating her. Leon stood just behind her, as still as a statue, his face pale with fear and something else, something darker that Jasmine couldn't quite place. "They found us," Leon whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with dread. Jasmine turned toward him, her eyes wide. "What do we do? We can't just stand here." "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "I never thought they'd come for me here. I thought I had more time, but..." The knock came again, louder and more insistent. Jasmine's stomach twisted. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but where could they possibly go? The house was old, falling apart in places, but it wasn't completely defenseless. There was a back door, hidden in the kitchen, that led to a small alley behind the house. It wasn't much. But it might be their only chance. "Come on," she said, grabbing Leon's arm and pulling him toward the back door. "We can't stay here. We have to leave now." But Leon didn't move. He was staring at the door, his face full of indecision. His eyes flickered with something like regret, but Jasmine couldn't understand why he wasn't moving. "Leon," she urged, her voice rising. "We need to go. Now." He snapped out of his daze, his expression hardening. "You don't understand, Jasmine. I can't run anymore." Jasmine's stomach sank. "What are you talking about?" Leon looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. "I brought this on you. I dragged you into this mess, and now there's no way out. These people, they won't stop until they get what they want. Then we'll fight," Jasmine said, her voice fierce. "I'm not letting them take you, or us." Leon shook his head. "It's not that simple. They're not just after me. They're after both of us now. They've already made sure that there's nowhere we can hide. I can't protect you from them anymore." "Then let me help you protect us," she pleaded, her voice desperate. "We can't just give up." But Leon didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward the door, his steps heavy. Jasmine's heart raced as she watched him, unsure of what he was about to do. He was doing the one thing she feared the most, giving in. "Leon, no," she shouted, reaching out to grab his arm, but he shrugged her off. "I have to end this," he said, his voice resigned. "It's the only way to make sure you're safe. The only way to stop them from coming after us again." Jasmine's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. It didn't make sense. Leon was talking like this was the end, like there was no hope left. But Jasmine couldn't accept that. She couldn't let him throw everything away, not when they had so much to live for. "Don't do this," she begged, stepping closer to him. "We're stronger together. We can still figure this out. Please, Leon." He looked at her, his eyes filled with regret and sorrow. "I wish I could believe that," he said softly. "But it's too late." The knock at the door came again, louder, more urgent. Jasmine's panic spiked. They didn't have much time. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Let me help you. I don't want to lose you." Leon turned away, walking toward the door. "You already have." Before Jasmine could react, the door crashed open with a force that sent a chill down her spine. Standing in the doorway was a tall man, his face obscured by the shadows. His eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion, as if he were looking at nothing more than an object. Behind him stood two other men, equally imposing, their faces hidden in the dim light. They were dressed in dark suits, their movements deliberate, like predators circling their prey. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. They were here. The people Leon had been running from. They had come to collect. "Leon," the man in the doorway said, his voice low and menacing. "It's time to pay the price." Jasmine stepped back, instinctively moving in front of Leon, her body a barrier between him and the men. "What do you want with him?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fear and anger. The man's eyes flicked to her, then back to Leon. "You shouldn't have gotten involved with him," he said coldly. "But it's too late now. The debts have been paid, and you both belong to us." Jasmine felt a cold chill wash over her. The debt. Leon had never told her about any debts. He had kept everything from her, and now it was too late. The truth had come crashing down, and it was worse than she had imagined. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice pleading. "We can make a deal. We can work something out." The man's lips curled into a smirk. "You think this is negotiable? You think we care about deals?" Jasmine's mind raced. There had to be something, anything, she could do to get them out of this. But she was out of ideas. The fear was suffocating, and her only thought was survival. Suddenly, Leon stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, pushing her behind him. "Don't worry about me," he said quietly. "This is my mess. Let me handle it." Jasmine shook her head, grabbing his arm. "I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together." The man in the doorway chuckled darkly. "How touching," he said. "But this is over. You're both coming with us." Jasmine didn't know what to do, but then she heard something. A faint noise, distant but growing louder. It sounded like a car. A loud engine revving. And then, a crash. The door to the house exploded open. The sound of gunfire echoed in the air, and the men in dark suits jerked back in shock. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat as the new arrivals stormed in, armed, determined, and focused. For a moment, everything stood still. The men in dark suits, the intruders, the violence hanging in the air, it all felt surreal. It was like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. But then, the world exploded into chaos. The intruders fought back. Gunshots rang out. The men in dark suits stumbled backward, trying to shield themselves, but the new arrivals were relentless. Jasmine ducked behind the wall, her heart racing, her body trembling. She could hardly breathe, couldn't process the whirlwind of violence unfolding before her. And then it stopped. The gunshots ceased. The house was eerily quiet again, save for the ringing in her ears and the heavy breaths coming from everyone around her. Jasmine's mind was spinning, her heart thundering in her chest. Who were these people? Were they friends or foes? She didn't know, but for now, they had given them a fighting chance. The figure who had led the charge, Carter, stepped forward, his face hard, his voice low. "Get up, both of you. It's not over yet." Jasmine didn't move. "What's going on? Who are they?" "They're here to help you," Carter said, his eyes flickering to Leon. "But it's not safe here anymore. We need to go. Now." Jasmine's legs shook as she stood, but she didn't argue. She wasn't about to let another opportunity slip away. Leon had no choice but to follow. Together, they fled into the night, not knowing what awaited them, but knowing they had to keep moving, or it would all be over. This part concludes the story, with Carter's team intervening and saving them, but leaving behind many unanswered questions. The cliffhanger brings a final, intense resolution to the immediate threat but leaves the future uncertain, suggesting a deeper mystery yet to be unraveled.